Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be covering an AP environmental free response question from the 2010 AP test. We're going to specifically be going over number 4 of that test and going through all the questions, answering them completely, and talking about other answers that would also work for the various questions, since a lot of these are open-ended. So number 4 states, scientific evidence shows a direct relationship between sea level and the global mean atmospheric temperature at Earth's surface. Increases in the global mean atmospheric temperature during the past century have been accompanied by a gradual increase in sea level. Currently, the average rate of increase in sea level is 3 millimeters per year. Additional increases in sea level are expected during the next century as global mean atmospheric temperatures continue to rise. These increases in sea level will affect coastal ecosystems as well as human activity along coastal margins. Okay, so the first one, part A, states that based on the rate cited above, calculate the expected increase in a sea level in meters during the next 50 years. So this might psych a little bit of people out because it's a math problem and, sometimes that gets us during these tests. But do not freak out because, as it says in the question, the rate cited above. You don't need to know any other rates. You don't need to know any other equations. All you really need to know is that this is in millimeters per year and that you have to put it into meters per year. So we're going to go ahead and do that conversion. All right, so in order to do this conversion, there's a couple of ways that you can go about this. One, you can either have it memorized and be able to kind of do it in your head. They will want to see you working out this dimensional analysis problem or conversion problem. This is something that you probably have done in like a chemistry class, hopefully. Essentially, how you would set this up if you're doing a formal dimensional analysis is that you would put your 3 millimeters on top. And then we know that's per year. We're going to keep the year. The year is fine. We only need to be converting it to millimeters and then also multiplying it by that 50-year time. So we have years. Our units there are good. We just need to get it into meters. So personally, what I like to do is I like to go ahead and just get the conversion out of the way. So for millimeters, we have 1,000 millimeters in 1 meter. We're going from smaller to bigger though, so this number is going to get smaller because it wouldn't make sense, right, if we're starting with millimeters and going to meters, that we're going to have a huge number. So to get this conversion out of the way, we're going to multiply this and say that 1,000 millimeters are in 1 meter. So that is now out of the way. I could multiply that together right now. And I am at meters over years. So then the last step to this problem is that I multiply it by that 50-year time. So times 50 years. We're going to put that into a calculator or do it in your head if you're good at, math in your head. And so what we should end up getting is 0.15 meters. So our years cancel out. We're left with meters on top. And that is our answer. Part B states, identify 2 phenomena that result from an increase in global mean atmospheric temperature and that contribute to increases in sea level. For each phenomenon that you identify, explain how it causes sea level to increase. All right, so a couple of things before we dive into this question. So first off, it is in bold, capitalized, all that good stuff, that we need 2 identifications, okay? So 2 identifications. When you are tasked with questions like these, oftentimes we start just creating a list and we kind of just, if we're nervous, we might just throw stuff at the wall, right? Do not do that. So first of all, scoring in these tests, they're only going to look at the first 2 anyway. So if you have a long list after that, even if those are correct, they are not going to look at them. They're going to look at your first point and your second point and say, that one's good, that one's not, and move on. Okay? So do not create a 50-point list for them to look at because they are not going to grade it. All right, the second point to this is the wording, so the verbiage that they're using here. They use a lot of like words to say just temperature, right? An increase in global temperatures. Instead, they say global mean atmospheric temperature. Don't let that trip you up. So we're looking at how an increase, let me do a different color here, an increase in temps worldwide globally, so an increase in temps, how does that correlate to an increase in sea levels? Or how will that lead to an increase in sea levels? And we're looking at two phenomena. So we have to identify two things that are going to happen with that pattern. Now, the first things that come to mind are probably, any of the ice that we have around the world heating up, melting, getting into the sea, and raising the levels that way. And that is a completely correct answer. However, you have to be careful how you word it. For example, if you just say ice caps, or if you just say polar ice caps, those are not acceptable answers by themselves. You have to be more specific. Instead of saying this, you could instead say melting of glaciers or melting of ice caps. We cannot just put ice caps, polar ice caps. What does that mean? It's like giving a number 7. Does that mean I have 7 eggs? Does that mean I have $7? What does the number 7 mean? All right, so make sure you're just being specific. But melting of glaciers is definitely a phenomenon that can happen. And remember, for each one that we identify, we also have to explain how it causes sea levels to increase. So if I said melting of glaciers, well, as the ice melts, the amount of water in the ocean is going to increase. So that would be my explanation. So I would put, again, don't just put ice caps, don't just put polar ice caps. Make sure you're explaining what's happening. So if one of my points, one of my identifications is melting of glaciers, I would say as ice melts, the amount of water in the ocean increases. And make sure you spell it out. I'm just using shorthand here for sake of time. But yeah, make sure you're putting things in complete sentences and explaining yourself thoroughly. Another phenomenon, so again, a lot of these have multiple answers that you could utilize. So another one, we're going to put them down here. Actually, we're on number 2, aren't we? So this would be like our second identification. So you could make the argument for melting ice sheets, so melting of ice sheets, right? So this would be like our Greenland or Antarctica locations. It would have nearly the same explanation as our previous one with melting of glaciers. If we have the melting of the ice sheets, as ice melts, again, the amount of water in the ocean increases. Third one, this one might be a little more on the, difficult side if we're thinking about it, but if you're a chemistry person, might be something you first go to. Thermal expansion of the ocean. So thermal expansion of the ocean. What that means is that as the ocean heats up, as water warms, water molecules literally move farther apart from each other, and that increases the volume of the ocean. So let me go ahead and write you out that explanation. So as water temps increase, molecules go farther apart. I'm going to go over here to the left side and continue my explanation since I did not give myself enough room. Move farther apart, increasing the volume of the ocean. All right, so those are 3 examples that you could put. Again, they're only going to grade the first 2 that you put. So if you put something completely different, and then later on you think of something and then you go ahead to add it to the list, do not do that, okay? So make sure you're brainstorming. Write the first two that you think of that are and that have good explanations to them. And yeah, that's part B. All right, part C. Describe 2 environmental impacts that increasing sea level will have on an estuarine or estuarine, however you pronounce it, ecosystem, such as those in the Mississippi Delta, Chesapeake Bay, and San Francisco Bay. All right, so just like the last one, this one is going to be only, again, 2 environmental impacts. So 2 impacts, 1 to state them. That's what's getting graded, even if you create a list of 15. So keep in mind, the first 2 you put, whatever you put, that is what's being looked at. So in my mind, because I am more of a plant person and I just, I'm into agriculture, stuff like that, the first thing that comes to mind for me in terms of environmental impacts are things essentially that are going to impact those plants that would be around an estuary. I suppose we should mention as well, just in case we've forgotten what an estuary is. So estuary. So this is an environment that has both water of fresh water and salt water. So it's basically a place where fresh water and salt water meet. So you can imagine the types of organisms that would be encountered here. Like, we have a pretty good variety, right? But not all of them are meant to have salt water. Not all of them are meant to have fresh water. So when we change the ratios in this estuary of we're now getting more salty if our sea level is increasing, how is that going to affect the organisms there? So the first thing that I would say is that we're going to have a big change in salinity of the soil, and not all plants are adapted to soil salinity. So that would be my first pick. That, again, that's just one thing that comes to mind for me. So changes in salinity of the environment or of the area. And so, again, we have to also describe this. So not only are we stating the 2 impacts, but it does specifically say to describe them as well. So we're going to do that. So with changes in salinity of the area, that might lead to a loss of some organisms. So this could lead to a loss of salt sensitive or salt intolerant organisms. And so that could be an impact that happens from the changing of the salt in the soil. Another one, so for our second impact, let me try to change colors here so we can see a little bit of a difference. Well, that's still, it's a close color. It's a little different though. Another impact, so estuaries are inherently places where, they absorb a lot of water. We have a lot of water systems going on here. So if we reduce the estuary, if that ecosystem reduces in size and any capacity, that's going to increase the likelihood of flooding of places around it. And so excess flooding, we're not getting that barrier that's protecting areas from, things like storm surges. If we have hurricanes, if we have big storms there, it's not protecting against erosion. So if we do have the storms, things can get washed away. And that's a big thing with these areas, is that specifically coastline erosion going into the ocean, that is land lost, right? And so that's not great. So a second impact could just be increased storm flooding, or if you want to say destruction, that would work as well. In areas around the estuary. And so just like we said here, describing that. So We said estuaries, they do in fact absorb excess water. So if we don't have that, then flooding will occur. So flooding will occur. Additionally, erosion just from the lack of barrier from the estuary. So these are just two impacts, but again, this is a very open-ended question. So other things that we could look at as well, we could say that increased nutrients load into the water. So estuaries filter out a lot of these nutrients. So without them, things like eutrophication, algal blooms, those are up for grabs, especially if we're talking about the Mississippi River Delta. That is, very, very common in that area. Just in general, loss, flooding, erosion of the habitat. We could get, again, that talking about the ratio of freshwater to saltwater, we could get a conversion to more of saltwater, having more of like an open ocean or open water type environment, which means that we could, again, have a loss of species that aren't adapted to that kind of environment. That can be fish, that can be, migratory birds. We have lots of species, organisms that rely on this area. So a lot of changes would occur, especially to that intertidal zone area or that sunlit zone. So this is part C. All right, so our last part D, says, although sea level has been rising for over a century, human populations in coastal areas have increased dramatically during this period. So this is a two-part question. The first part, too, it says, describe one negative economic impact that an increase in sea level will have on people who live along a coastline. All right, so we are focusing on the first part to this. So one negative economic impact. What's an economic impact? This is something that affects people's livelihoods. So the people who live there, it could affect them either by them having to pay more. It could affect them by them losing their jobs. There's lots of options out there. Okay. So one thing, if we're stemming off the last question, which we totally can do, we talked about, how nutrients kind of get messed up in areas, especially these estuaries, these coastlines that have them. The nutrients get messed up. We might have a loss of species. And anytime we have a loss of species, or we have species that are kind of outside their ecological tolerance levels, we're going to have some stress put on the area. So, for example, let's say we have some types of, fish that just don't come around anymore, or in such small populations we cannot fish them without completely, eradicating them from the area. That's a loss of income. That is a loss of a potential job that someone could have. So that would be an example of an economic impact, one negative one. So loss of job, income, livelihood, however you want to describe it. And this would be as a result of potential loss of organisms due to effects from rising sea levels. And so who would this specifically affect? Well, this would specifically take out or lessen jobs for commercial fishing or fisheries. Fishing/fisheries. I'm just trying to give you guys some various vocabulary so you don't think you have to, write the same thing over and over again. You do have various various words out there that kind of mean more or less the same thing. So fisheries, commercial fishing, stuff like that. All right. So then on to the second part of this. I'm going to go ahead and get a clean page for this. So the part 2 now, on part 2 of this, says describe 2 viable strategies that governments could use to discourage people from moving to coastal areas. All right, actually, before I get ahead of myself, before we go to the second part, I just wanted to also tell you or talk about like a couple of things that you could put other than this. I realized I didn't go through the other options, and there absolutely are some. So we did loss of jobs specifically with commercial fishing, but other things that, you could have put here that are economic. So people who live on coastal cities, they a lot of times rely on the ocean, the water system, to provide them with food. So loss of food supply, people who rely on specifically fishing in that area to feed them, that is a economic impact. They would have to now go buy other food to eat. Another one could be damage to property. So if we are building like houses there, obviously we know that that's going to be a bit more expensive in terms of keeping them safe, having insurance that says, hey, if something is to happen to your home, we'll pay for it. So that means that, your property values could increase, or your property insurance values could increase. On the other opposite end of that, other people might not want to move there. So then you buy this house and it's not worth what it used to be. So that's an economic impact as well, if you want to think about it as that. So lots of options. Now let's go to number 2. All right, so this one, again, we have 2 strategies that we are looking at. Again, just like the previous times, we can't just make a list of 15 things. Even though there might be 15 things out there we could talk about, they're only going to look at the first 2 you put. So make sure that you can, have good reasoning, good backing to those 2. So in my mind, the 2 viable strategies governments could use to discourage people from moving to coastland areas or coastal areas. The first one I like to think of is, especially if we're talking about, these rising sea levels, education on what's happening in the environment is vital. You would be surprised at how many people just don't know what's going on. So perhaps my first strategy would be educating the public on environmental issues in the area. I always like this one. I think this one's a really good, answer, because always education is never going to hurt anything. So, why this is important, what will this do essentially? Well, hopefully by educating the public on environmental issues, because again, we have to describe this, our outcome that we would be looking for is just to essentially discourage the movement to these coastal areas, or kind of like persuading people to, not persuading, but through educating them, really like showing them, hey, it's not in your best interest and it's not in the environment's best interest for you to live there. So discouraging people by showing them scientific reasoning for why they shouldn't live there. There we go. So that could absolutely be one of the things that you could put. A second option could be offering incentives. So maybe if people are already on the coastline, offering them incentives or stipends to move more inland so that they don't have to be living on the coastline. So offering stipends or incentives to move more inland. There we go. And so essentially, what this would do is like, if, you have like jobs, if you have houses, if you have like reduced properties, reduced property prices, that could be an incentive for people to, not live on the coastal areas. So it makes moving affordable, makes moving out of those places affordable. So these again are just a couple of ones that you could put. Other things could be that, truly the government just designates the coastal areas as like city property or something like that. Maybe we want to like discourage people from being in that area, impose taxes on, to support the beach. So if people do want to go to these coastal areas, we're not polluting, or if we are, we're being held accountable. So there's lots of different things that you could put here. But I hope that this helped kind of get you thinking about how to strategize and answer these questions. If you have any questions of your own, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you think of anything that I didn't say that you think would be good, leave that too. And yeah, if you want more practice with this, follow. And yeah, hope the year goes well, or if the year is ending for you, hope it went well. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one. Bye.